Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's my first look for week 14 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And YouTube tells me around 50% of the people watching these videos have not yet subscribed. So if you're a frequent visitor of the channel or if you're just new and you like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. And that's obviously going to help me out as well. And if you're going to follow me over on social media, the handle's in the bottom left hand corner of your screen. If you want to support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. You can get access into the entire NFL DFS state sheet, which I am previewing for you guys in the screen behind me. And without further ado, let's get into this week's video. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position, and there's quite a few places to go this week, so I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to end up roster construction-wise, but that's why this is just the first look video. We're just trying to see what the slate looks like, find some good matchups, guys that have good price tags, and things like that. And this goes for all positions, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, even defenses. There's just so many places you can go this week. But we'll start up top with Patrick Mahomes at $8,100. He's the most expensive quarterback on the slate, but it makes sense because he's the best quarterback in football, and the Chiefs' offense is just really unfair. It's really hard to stop Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill. There's some other good secondary options in offense as well. Now, the matchup versus Miami, it's actually not that great. They got some good pieces in their secondary, and they've been pretty tough versus the past this season. They've actually been a bit easier to run on, but still, it's Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and I don't really care what the matchup is. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers had a pretty solid defense, and you saw what happened when they faced the Chiefs, so I really have no concerns here. But when it comes to the matchup, even though they are 10th DVA versus the pass and allowing the 9th fewest points per game to the quarterback position, and barely over a passing touchdown per game, but like I said earlier, it's Patrick Mahomes. Don't really care about matchups, but you definitely don't have to go here in cash games because all the Chiefs are very expensive. I believe Tyreek Hill is at $8,500, Travis Kelce somewhere around $7,000, and obviously Patrick Mahomes is pretty expensive here. So these guys are a fine tournament stack because the matchup versus Miami isn't exactly the greatest, and they do play at a pretty slow pace. But still, the numbers for Mahomes are great this year. He's not really turned the ball over at all. About 40 passing attempts per game, close to a 70% completion percentage, and well over 300 passing yards per game. So if you got the money for him, sure. He's the best quarterback in football. I have no complaints there. I just think he's more of a tournament play than a cash play this week. And they're also 7-point favorites, and I could see that game not being too competitive. Although the Dolphins aren't the worst team in the world. They actually have a decent record, and they're competing for the AFC East. So I don't think this is going to be an absolute blowout, but even then, I don't even care. So Patrick Mahomes, fine tournament play, and I'll leave it as that. Russell Wilson at $7,900. He has certainly fallen off from his lofty pedestal he was on the earlier portion of the season. He was on absolute fire. That has definitely slowed down the past month or so. But hey, when you're facing the Jets, it's always a good get-right spot because they're the worst team in the league versus the past this season. And the Seahawks are playing at home with a team total above 30 this week. Now, the only problem is that they are 13.5-point favorites, so I could see a scenario where in the second half or the fourth quarter, they're really not going to have to try in this game. So that's the only concern there. But the Seahawks defense, while they have been improving, they're still not the greatest defense in the world, and there's a chance they could let the New York Jets at least be somewhat competitive in this game. We saw that last week with the Giants, where the Giants actually pulled off the upset versus Seattle. So there is always a chance this game could stay close, and obviously the numbers for him have been pretty solid this season, close to 300 passing yards per game, over 2.5 passing touchdowns, a 70% completion percentage, and he offers you some rushing upside as well, where he's close to 40 yards rushing per game, which is kind of a baked-in passing touchdown in his floor. Now the matchup versus the Jets, like I mentioned earlier, it's absolutely fantastic. They just allowed close to 40 Draftkings points to Derek Carr, and Russell Wilson has some elite options to get the ball to in DK Metcalf, who's one of the best wide receivers in football this season, and then Tyler Lockett's a fine option as well. He's just been pretty consistent this year, but he is definitely capable of having some pretty large games. But the Jets are 32nd DVA versus the pass, which is absolutely dead last. They're allowing the third most points per game to the quarterback position and close to 300 passing yards per game. So Russell Wilson, I do think he's a fine option. He's not a cash game lock by any means because of that $8,000 price tag. He certainly has been on fire the past month, and there are some good options that I think could at least compete with the points that Russell Wilson and Patrick Mahomes are going to score, and they're a lot cheaper. And I think on a point per dollar basis, they're probably going to grade out better anyway. But it's definitely a fantastic spot versus the New York Jets. Then Aaron Rodgers at $7,500. He was way too cheap last week. He was below $7,000, and now his price came up about $700 and that's $7,500. But he's going up against the Detroit Lions, and it's a fantastic matchup. They have the highest team total in the week at 31.25. This is also the highest over-under game of the week as well at 55 points, and they're 7.5-point favorites on the road in Detroit. And fantastic matchup here for Aaron Rodgers. He's been great all season long. Really hasn't had a bad game. Close to 300 passing yards per game with 3 passing touchdowns, close to a 70% completion percentage. As one of the best wide receivers in football, and Devonta Adams to get the ball to. Robert Tonyan's not a bad tight end as well, and Aaron Jones is a threat through the air too. But they're 28th DVA versus the pass, and they're 22nd versus quarterback. So it should be another good game for Aaron Rodgers here, with in addition to Devonta Adams. It's really just going to be a matter if the Detroit Lions can keep this game competitive. But the Packers defense hasn't exactly been great this year, so if they can let the Detroit Lions stay a little bit close, I could see a big game from Aaron Rodgers. And then dropping down to more so the mid-range here with Justin Herbert and Ryan Tannehill. Justin Herbert comes in at $6,800, and he's got to be one of the best quarterback options to use on this slate, in my opinion. I feel like he's a little bit too cheap, and I was surprised when I saw the Vegas over-under this game at 49.5. I thought for sure this would be over 50 points, and I was assuming the Los Angeles Chargers were going to have a team total close to 30 this week. Now, I know they absolutely got blanked last week versus the New England Patriots, but this Atlanta defense, it's not that great, and they've been awful versus quarterbacks and wide receivers and tight ends this season, and we have some really good offensive pieces here with Justin Herbert, Austin Eckler, and Keenan Allen. So I think they're going to surpass their team total. And this is a great bounce back spot versus Atlanta. And on the season, he's been pretty excellent outside of that last game versus the Patriots. But close to 300 passing yards per game, over 40 passing attempts per game. Wasn't really turning over the ball too much, so less than 1 pick per game. Obviously, that's higher than guys like Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes. But still, he's a rookie quarterback. He's still learning. But this is a fantastic matchup versus Atlanta. They're 19th DVA versus the pass, but they're still getting the most points per game to the quarterback position, close to 27 points per game. 300 passing yards per game and 2 passing touchdowns. So Justin Herbert, she would have bounced back in a nice way here versus Atlanta at home. Then Ryan Tannehill at $6,700. Now I will say I like Derrick Henry a bit more in this game versus Jacksonville, just because he's got a good track record versus Jacksonville, and we're getting later into the season where that's usually when Derrick Henry tends to shine. Now he had a really bad game versus the Cleveland Browns, although the game script got absolutely out of hand there. They were down 30 points at the half, 31 points, something like that. I believe the score was 31-7, if I remember correctly. I was going to say 31-8, but I think I'm thinking of a different game. And I can see this being more of a Derrick Henry game, but Ryan Tannehill, there's definitely upside here. Jacksonville's been one of the worst defenses in all aspects this season. They're bad versus the pass and versus the run. So I could see them both having some pretty strong games here. The price is up there. He's close to $7,000, and I would really just much rather play Justin Herbert here at $6,800, just because I'd be more leaning towards the run game for the Tennessee Titans, as they are 7-point favorites. Now, they're on the road, but they do have a 30-point implied team total with a 53-point over-under. Their defense isn't exactly that great, so if this game does stay competitive and back and forth, I could definitely see a big game here from Ryan Tannehill. They just tend to be a run-first team. He's only averaging 31 passing attempts per game compared to Justin Herbert's 41 pass attempts per game, so that's the only concern there. Ryan Tannehill's got to be a bit more efficient, but he's got good weapons to get the ball to, and A.J. Brown, Corey Davis, even Anthony Firkser wasn't that bad in the last game, although it took him a while to get the value. I think he ended up with 10 fantasy points. Pruitt, he was the guy that ended up catching that touchdown early. Then he got lucky with a touchdown fumble recovery, so sucked that could have been Anthony Firkser, but he still ended up getting there. But we'll see if Johnny Smith's back this week, but he's got good weapons to get the ball to, and below $7,000, I think he's a fine mid-range quarterback this week in a great spot versus the Jaguars, as they are 31st DVA versus the pass, which is only the only worst defense is the New York Jets, and both those defenses are absolutely awful versus the pass, and they're allowing the 4th most points per game to the position. So I do think Ryan Tannehill is certainly in play here versus the Jaguars. Then dropping down to the value quarterbacks, we got quite a few this week. Now, I wouldn't say I'm overly excited about using these guys, although Mitch Trubisky is actually in a really good spot versus Houston. But we do have Matt Ryan here at $5,700, and it certainly is tough to trust this guy. But when Julio Jones is on the field, he's always at least somewhat viable, especially below $6,000. Now, the matchup versus the Chargers, I would say it's kind of just ho-hum. It's more middle of the pack, although versus quarterbacks this year, they do rank 22nd, allowing 22 Draftkings points per game. Now, that's less than 2 passing touchdowns per game and like 222 passing yards, but I still think he's a fine option here since Julio Jones is back. He's got good weapons to get the ball to, and Hayden Hurst, Julio Jones, and Calvin Ridley, and they do throw the ball quite a bit, close to 40 passing attempts per game, although he is a tough guy to trust. He is on the road, but I could definitely see that game shooting out, because I think it's a little bit too low at 49.5 points. Now, I could be wrong there, but I really was expecting that to be over 50 points when I first opened up the Vegas totals, scores, whatever. So I think he's a fun option. What could be a back-and-forth game. Then Trubisky at $5,600. He kind of threw that game away, or I guess fumbled the game away last week versus the Detroit Lions. But at $5,600, he's certainly viable, and he has been racking up the passing yards the past 2 weeks. And I say that when relative to his price tag. It's nothing crazy, but it's around 250 passing yards per game, which is fine when you're below $6,000. Also has 4 touchdowns in that span as well. although he's still not the greatest quarterback in the world. But if he can get you around 15 to 20 points, that's not really hurting you too much at $5,600. And it's a good matchup versus Houston. Now, only a 45-point over-under in this game, and they only have a 22-point implied team total. And it's actually a better matchup on the ground than it is through the air versus Houston. But overall, this is not a defense you should be too concerned about. They are 22nd DVA versus the pass, and they're 20th versus quarterbacks, allowing 270 passing yards per game. So Trubisky, I think he's a fine option here. I don't think he's going to light the world on fire, but relative to his price tag, I do think he's a good point per dollar option play this week. Then Jalen Hurts, he got the nod to be the starting quarterback this week versus New Orleans. He's playing at home, but it's not a great matchup as New Orleans has I wouldn't say they're the greatest defense in the world. They're definitely really, really good versus the run. Versus the air, they're a little bit easier to pick on, but even then, they are pretty tough this season. If we look at their numbers right now, I believe they're allowing the third fewest points per game to the quarterback position, only 16.3 points per game, and their second DVA versus the pass. They're top versus the run and versus the pass. And Jalen Hurts, we don't really have any per game numbers to look at since this is going to be his first start, but he does offer some rushing upside. Did run the ball a handful of times in this last game last week, so I do think he's viable just because he can do some damage on the ground. If he does anything through the air, like a passing touchdown or two, we'll just take that as an added bonus. Not saying he's a bad passer, he can certainly do both well. It's just I'm not really expecting too much here, but he's only $5,100, so he definitely doesn't have to do a lot to pass value here, but it is not the greatest matchup in the world versus New Orleans and your first start as a rookie. And with that being said, I think we can move on to the running back position. We got quite a few options here this week, and like I said, it's a loaded slate. Usually I only have like 5 running backs listed, but now I think I have like 10, so I'll try to hit through them quickly here. But up top, we do have Christian McCaffrey at $9,200. It looks like he's going to be back this week, which is a great sign for fantasy owners and season-long leagues, and I'm sure you guys have been waiting a long time for him, and no better time to return than the start of the fantasy playoffs. And while I know it's a limited sample, in the 3 games he's played this year, and you gotta keep in mind he did get hurt in that Week 2 game versus Tampa Bay, he has scored 28 points, 24 points, and then 37 points Week 9 versus Kansas City, where he absolutely went off. So, yeah, he's going to be a good option here if he's fully good to go, which it sounds like he's going to be. And the Panthers might be down a few bodies here. DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel did get put on the COVID list. Now, we have no idea if they're going to be able to return Sunday or not yet as of right now. So, it's kind of questionable up in the air. But if they're out, that just makes the offense even more concentrated. It's going to be the Robbie Anderson and the Christian McCaffrey show. So, it would definitely be a really solid option here. I think it'd be a solid option either way if they're in. But they are 3.5-point favorites at home versus Denver. The matchup's kind of so-so. They're 19th versus the run, and they're allowing the 17th most points per game to the running back position. So that's kind of just middle of the pack here. But Christian McCaffrey is one of, if not the best running back in football, and he's definitely a huge threat through the air. He had, 10 targets in the last game he played? Yeah, 10 targets, 10 catches, 82 receiving yards, and got into the end zone. That's just the upside that Christian McCaffrey offers you each and every single time he's on the football field. So far this season, he's got a 16.1% target share, 20 rushing attempts per game. So we're looking at, if he's good to go, we're looking at around 20 or 30 touches from CMC. And I would definitely be surprised if I would definitely be surprised if he doesn't get into the end zone here. So assuming he's good to go, he's definitely a fine option here if you want to spend all the way up at running back. Then Derrick Henry at $8,700. I would say you're probably picking between these two if you're spending top dollar for a running back. But Derrick Henry's in a fantastic spot here versus Jacksonville. Now, I know earlier on in the season, I forget which week that was. It might have been week 2 or week 3 if I can't remember off the top of my head, but he did face Jacksonville and he did bust in that matchup at a pretty cheap price point. But it's December. Derrick Henry always comes alive late in the season, and he's got a good track record versus Jacksonville as well. But this should be a good game for fantasy purposes. We have a 53-point over-under, which is the second highest total on the slate, and the Titans have a 30-point implied team total, and they're 7-point favorites here, so it should be a heavy dose of Derrick Henry. Now, I know he busted last week, but that game script got completely out of hand for the Tennessee Titans. They had to throw the ball most of that game because they were down 30-some points at halftime. The Browns just absolutely stuck it to them. But assuming that doesn't happen again here, I think they are going to win this game and play with a lead for the most part, although both these defenses aren't that great. But the volume will be there, 20-30 touches for Derrick Henry here. Now, the majority of that will be on the ground. He only has a 7% target share in the season, averaging less than 2 targets per game, but close to 5 yards per carry, and I'd be very, very surprised if he does not find the end zone in this one. And Jacksonville are 26th DVA versus the run, and they're allowing the 4th most points per game to the running back position, so he's definitely in a fantastic spot to bounce back this week. Then we have a lot of mid-range running backs here. We got about 5 or 6 of them, so I'm going to try not to talk about them too long because not much is really separating these guys. But Aaron Jones at $7,600. He had, a 70-yard touchdown last week versus the Philadelphia Eagles, which was kind of responsible for the majority of his production in that game, but still, end result was pretty good. But this is a fantastic matchup versus Detroit. I think that just allowed David Montgomery to be the RB1 of the entire week, if I remember correctly. I think David Montgomery did lead all running backs in points scored, unless I'm missing something in one of the primetime games. But yeah, just give up close to 30 points to David Montgomery, and I think Aaron Jones can have at least he's similar to that. I mean, he's one of the better running backs in football. Although the touches, he doesn't get elite volume, but he can be efficient with his touches at 5.2 yards per carry this season. And he's involved in the passing game as well, seeing close to 5 targets per game with a 15% target share. But Detroit has been the worst team in the league when it comes to fantasy running backs, allowing the most points per game, over 33 Draftkings points, close to 50 receiving yards per game, over half a receiving touchdown, and over a rushing touchdown per game as well. So a great spot for Aaron Jones. They're decent-sized favorites. Now, they're on the road, but they do have the highest implied T-total on the slate. So I think there should be some touchdown opportunity for Aaron Jones, and I would not be surprised if he gets over 100 total yards and finds the end zone in this one. So I think he's a fine mid-range option this week. Then James Robinson at $7,500. All this guy does is put up consistent scores each and every single week. And even when you look at the Vegas totals, like just to try to project game flow, it never looks like it's going to set up well for James Robinson, but it doesn't seem to matter. He tends to get there each and every single week. He has not scored below 10 points in a game all season long, and he's involved in the passing game as well. I believe he's had 6 playing from behind. He's going to get targets in the passing game, so he usually just gets there anyway. He's averaging about, 21, 22 touches per game this season, close to 80 rushing, or not close to 80 rushing yards. He is at 80 rushing yards per game, 4.6 yards per carry. Maybe not the most efficient back in the world, but volume, it's what's most important for a running back, and it's there for him every single week. He's pretty much the only running back that gets touches every week. I believe last week was the first time we've seen a other running back in this offense get a carry since early on in the season. In the matchup versus Tennessee is actually pretty solid. They're 25th versus running backs this season. They're 17th DVA versus the run, allowing close to 100 rushing yards per game. So James Robinson, he's a fine, safe option at $7,500. He doesn't exactly scream value to me, but more than likely he's going to get you around 15 to 20 points. So he's a comfortable play. But Austin Eckler at $7,000, he's got to be one of my top plays of the week here just because of how involved he is in the passing game. Now I fully expect the Chargers to bounce back here versus the Falcons. I personally feel like their implied team total is just a little bit too low here. I could be wrong, but it's just a really good spot versus Atlanta. They're not very good versus wide receivers. Running backs, they've been a bit stiff against, but Austin Eckler is kind of a hybrid with a wide receiver running back mix, so I'm kind of throwing him in there. They're in the wide receiver mix, but he's just so involved in the passing games. He gives them a very high floor, and they suck versus quarterbacks as well. Now, the one thing I will say, I saw a bit too much Kalen Ballage than I really cared for last week. I think he had 7 carries and 4 to 5 targets, which I was not hoping that was going to be the case because the first game Austin Eckler was back, Kalen Ballage did not play, but I was assuming he was kind of going to become an afterthought in the offense, and it was just going to be the Austin Eckler show. Eckler still dominated the snaps, but I would definitely saw a little bit more Kalen Ballage than I would have liked, but Austin Eckler was still heavily involved in this game. He had close to 10 targets, and he had 8 rushing attempts, so we're still looking at close to 20 opportunities in that game, and I would expect that to be somewhat similar to this one. You got to keep in mind the Chargers fell really, really behind in this one. They lost by, 45 points, and that's definitely not going to be the case once again. It's a good spot versus the Chargers versus the Falcons. And in limited games so far this season, he's got close to a 20% target share, over 6 targets per game. You got to keep in mind he did get hurt one of those games, so those numbers are going to be skewed a little bit, but we should be looking at 20-25 touches here from Austin Eckler, with maybe upside of more depending on how involved he's going to be in the passing game, or just see if he gets more carries in this one. Now, the Falcons have actually been a bit stingy versus running backs this season, allowing the 4th fewest points per game. They're 60th versus the run, but they've always struggled versus pass-catching running backs, and there's really not that many better pass-catching running backs than Austin Eckler here, so I think he's going to be a fine option, and I like him at $7,000. The price did come down from last week, I believe, a little bit. I think he was $70 to $100, so it didn't come down too much, but still a pretty good spot here versus Atlanta with his ability to be able to catch the ball. Chris Carson, $6,900. The snaps got ramped up for him last week, and it's a great spot here versus the Jets in terms of game flow, just because they're 13.5-point favorites at home. The Jets haven't exactly been bad versus running backs this year. They're actually 8th versus the run, but they are allowing the 19th most points per game to the running back position, which is below mid-pack here, and they're also allowing 6.5 catches per game to the running back position, which is near league high. And Carson did get 20 fantasy points last week, had a nice receiving touchdown, and he's always going to be involved in the passing game as well, which always gives him a nice floor. Now, Carlos Hyde's still going to be involved, but Chris Carson, I like his chances of finding the end zone here, maybe once or twice, because they are 13.5-point favorites, and I could see them running the ball quite a bit in the second half or the fourth quarter, just to end that game, because the Jets are certainly not in the business of trying to win football games right now. They definitely threw last week's game where they allowed Derek Carr to hit that Hail Mary play where they playing cover 0 or something like that. So they're definitely not really trying to go out there and win. So Chris Carson should be in line for a lot of work here versus a pretty poor Jets defense. Zeke at $6,600. So he had a fine game last night. If you guys were watching the Tuesday game, just he could not get into the end zone. And it wasn't due to lack of opportunity. They gave him 3 straight tries on the 1 yard line. The guy could just not get in there. Also, not having Zach Martin, one of the better offensive tackles in football, or offensive guards in football on the field, certainly doesn't help things, but it's a good spot here versus Cincinnati, and they're actually favorites in this game. They're 3.5-point favorites on the road versus Cincy, but definitely not the best defense in the world. They're kind of mid-pack versus running backs. They're 21st day versus the run, and allowing 16th most points per game to the running back position, but close to 120 rushing yards per game. They just haven't really given up many rushing touchdowns, and only half a rushing touchdown per game. But I like Zeke's chance of getting close to 100 total yards in this one. He should be able to find the end zone. Not saying that's a stone cold lock, but I like his chances of doing it, because, I mean, the opportunity was there in the last game. He just could not convert, but he's pretty cheap at $6,600. He's always involved in the passing game, close to 5 targets per game this season with over a 12% target share. He did have 13.5 points last night, which again wasn't great, but he's still at 18 carries and he had 6 targets, which is over 20 total opportunities. So at $6,600, I think he's in a fine spot there from a volume standpoint. Dave Montgomery at $6,500. The price came up $1,000 from last week, but he did crush last week, and he's actually been great 2 weeks in a row. Now, I would not be surprised if that continues for 3 weeks in a row versus Houston, who's been one of the worst run defenses in football this season. They're 27th DVA versus the run, and they're allowing the second most points per game to the running back position, 140 rushing yards per game, and 1.25 touchdown on the ground as well, and close to 50 receiving yards. And the great thing about Dave Montgomery is he very good? Maybe not, but he gets plenty of volume and he's really the only running back that's going to be involved in this offense, besides Cordell Patterson, who did get plenty of rushing attempts in that game and also had a rushing touchdown. So I guess that's the one downside there. But David Montgomery's going to play the majority of the snaps here, and it's a good spot versus Houston, and it's a close spread. So I don't really think I have to worry about the Bears falling too behind here because that Houston defense is pretty bad. And without Will Fuller, that offense definitely takes a hit on the other side of the ball. Then dropping down to some cheaper running backs, we have Myles Gaskin at $5,600. He had a respectable game last week, didn't really go off, but he had around 15, 16 points, if I remember correctly. Had a nice catch. I believe it was about 20, 30 yards. But he's going to be the main running back here, and the one way to beat Kansas City is to keep the ball out of Patrick Mahomes' hands. I really don't think they're going to have Tua chuck the ball all game long. They're probably going to keep it on the ground with Myles Gaskin, try to milk that clock out so Patrick Mahomes has the ball in his hands less amount of time as possible. Because when you give Patrick Mahomes the ball, usually good things happen, and not good things happen for your defense. So I would assume the Miami Dolphins try to play keep away here. And they do play at a pretty slow pace this season, so I could definitely see that being the way to go for them. And on the season, Gaskin's averaging about 15 rushing attempts per game and about 4.5, 5 targets per game. So we should have around 20 total touches. And the Chiefs are a run funnel defense. They are dead last, 32nd DV versus the run. A lot better versus the pass, but versus the run, that's the way to beat them, and that has been the way to go for quite a few seasons now. And they're also allowing the 19th most points per game to the running back position, over 100 yards rushing per game, and over 40 receiving yards per game to the running back position as well. So Gaskin at $5,600, I think he's a fine volume play and in a good matchup, and I really don't see the Dolphins falling too behind here because they were a respectable team. They're not the Dolphins of old when they were, like 20-some underdogs versus the Patriots. I remember that season. Was it last year? Either last year or a season ago, I can't remember, but yeah, they've definitely improved since then. Then J.D. McKissick at $4,900. Sounds like Antonio Gibson is not going to play in this one. He's got a severe case of turf toe. And McKissick had 10 targets last game, and he caught all 10 of them. Didn't really destroy in the yardage department, but that's great for PPR scoring like Draftkings is. So at $4,900, assuming Antonio Gibson is out, he is definitely in play for me with how involved he is in the passing game. And that's really as far as I'll go talking about J.D. McKissick. He's just a fine PPR play at $4,900. Now we'll move on to the wide receiver position. We got quite a few guys to talk about once again. But we'll start all the way up top with Devonta Adams at $9,300. You know what you're going to get with him. You're going to usually get 100-plus yards, and he's going to find the end zone once, twice, or maybe even 3 times. He's got one of the best quarterbacks in football throwing the football, and the volume is there each and every single week. He's really yet to have a bad game besides that Tampa Bay game, because the one game versus Detroit, he did get hurt in that game, did not play in the second half, and the Packers were absolutely killing them, so he didn't really even have to go in. And then versus the Bears, the game kind of got out of hand in the second half, but he still got into the end zone in that one and scored close to 20 Draftkings points. Obviously, if he only scores like 15 to 20 points, you're pretty disappointed with Devonta Adams, but for the most part this season, he's usually scoring about 30 fantasy points, and I would not be surprised if that happens here versus Detroit. They have the highest team total on the slate. They also have the highest over-under, 7.5 point favorites, but I could see this game being at least somewhat close. It is a divisional matchup, and they're on the road, so I guess that'll help things maybe stay close a little bit. And also they got rid of Matt Patricia, which always helps the team as well. But on the season, over 100 receiving yards, over 100 receiving yards per game. Obviously, I'd hope he'd be above 100 receiving yards total in the season. Over 10 targets per game, 1.3 receiving touchdowns per game. The guy scores pretty much each and every single game, and it's never surprising if he gets into the end zone twice or 3 times. A 33% target share in the season, close to a 40% market share of the team's air yards, and a 76% weight opportunity share. So Devonta Adams, I know I don't typically like to spend top dollar for wide receivers, but the way he's been playing this season, he's been consistent than a lot of running backs, more consistent than a lot of running backs this year. So I have no issues at all if you want to roster him at $9,300, 0.32 targets per route ran, 0.78 fantasy points per route ran, and 3.02 yards per route ran. All numbers pretty much lead the entire league. So obviously a great spot here versus Detroit, a huge wide receiver versus cornerback matchup advantage this week per PFF. They're 28th versus the pass, and they're 23rd in points per game to the wide receiver position. Don't really care about matchups when it comes to Devonta Adams. When you give him a good matchup, it just makes me like him even more. So if you got the money for him, it's a great spot. You know what you're going to get with him each and every single week. Keenan Allen at $7,700, he's a lot more affordable, and I really have a lot of interest in his quarterback this week at only $6,800, so this could be a really nice stack. And I actually don't hate the trio of just the big Chargers players this week with Keenan Allen, Justin Herbert, and Austin Eckler. I think all those guys are playable, and it might not be that hard to fit them all in because they are all around respectable price ranges. None of them are above $8,000, so I think it's definitely possible to do that this week, and that's where pretty much all the production goes in that offense. It's Allen, it's Eckler, and it's Justin Herbert for the most part. Now, I know he's kind of cooled down the past 2 weeks, and obviously having Austin Eckler could be a big part of that because Austin Eckler is demanding around 10 targets per game, so that obviously can take away from Keenan Allen a little bit, but it's still a great matchup versus the Falcons, and he's still averaging over 10 targets per game with close to a 30% target share, and the Falcons are allowing the second most points per game to the wide receiver position at 45 points per game and over 200 receiving yards per game as well, so Keenan Allen obviously in a great spot here versus Atlanta. Tyler Lockett at $7,200, he's wildly inconsistent. He can have huge blow-up games, and he can disappear for a couple catches for 40 yards in a game as well. But it's a great spot versus the Jets. They are dead last 32nd DVA versus the pass, and their corners are absolutely horrendous. He's got one of the better wide receiver versus cornerback matchup advantages this week per PFF, and the Jets are allowing the 25th most points per game to the wide receiver position, so he is certainly play here at $7,200. He's a lot cheaper than DK Metcalf. I always say I feel like DK Metcalf is definitely going to score more points than Tyler Lockett, but it always comes at the cost of a massive. Well, it used to not be a massive price difference. It is now because they used to be around the same price tag. Sometimes even Tyler Lockett, I want to say, was more expensive than Metcalf in a couple of games this year, although that might not be exactly correct. But it used to be really close. Now Metcalf he's close to $9,000, which is really hard to justify paying $9,000 for him. So Lockett at $7,200. They have similar target shares on the season. I think is a fine option to pair with Russ. Allen Robinson at $6,800. Kind of disappointed last week. I thought it was going to be a big game from Allen Robinson, although he didn't absolutely suck or anything. But you definitely wanted more than 13.5 fantasy points from a guy that was around this price tag last week. I think he was $6,700 last week. He's up $100 at $6,800. But the volume's there. He's a very talented wide receiver. The only thing that goes wrong for him every single week is pretty much quarterback play, and it's not the best offense in the world. But close to 10 targets per game, 30% market share of the team's air yards, a 25% target share. Always usually has a nice wide receiver versus quarterback matchup advantage in the matchup column on PFF. And their 21st. They're 22nd DA versus the pass, and they're 21st versus wide receivers this season. So it's a good spot for Allen Robinson. He's actually a decently priced option to pair with Mitch Trubisky this week if you want to go with that route. I think he is fine. Now, Robbie Anderson is $6,200. So we have a lot of news to discuss with the Carolina Panthers, and I kind of already mentioned that when I was talking about Christian McCaffrey. But there's a chance DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel could be out for this game. Now, as of right now, we don't know if they actually have it or if they're in close contact or whatever. I don't have that news yet. But if they both happen to miss this game, it would be really hard to justify not playing Robbie Anderson at $6,200. And the matchup versus Denver. So, sorry to cut the video really quick, but I was talking about Robbie Anderson and the Broncos secondary. They're going to be without Bryce Callahan and AJ Boyes. He just got suspended 6 games. That's kind of tied into the Will Fuller thing, and I forget who else the other guy that got suspended, but that's going to be a beat-up secondary. So Robbie Anderson, if those guys are both out, we're talking like DJ Moore has a very similar target share to Robbie Anderson this season with close to a 25% target share. Curtis Samuel's around that 15 to 20% range, so it would pretty much be the Robbie Anderson show, and he's only $6,200. I say only, but if those guys are out, he would, I think honestly, you could justify him being close to $7,000. So he would certainly be in play for me here. And like I said, the Broncos, they're not the, I don't think I said that earlier. Again, I had to cut the video, so I forget exactly where I let off with Robbie Anderson. But this season, they're 50th versus the pass, and they're allowing the 9th fewest points in the wide receiver position. But you take their 2 top cornerbacks out, Robbie Anderson would certainly be in play for me. So we'd have a lot of interest there. We're just going to have to keep our eyes and ears peeled for the news on DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel. Brandon Cooks at $6,100. Now, it was Kiki Cutie who actually had the big game for the Texans, but Cooks is still the wide receiver 1 in this offense, and I'm surprised he actually came back in that game. If you guys didn't know, Brandon Cooks got his head turned into scrambled eggs for a play. Not sure how they allowed him to come back in. The guy has had a long history of concussions, so he came back in and he caught a catch or two. Didn't absolutely kill you. I think he had, around 11 to 13 points, which is obviously we expected more, but it still got the job done around $5,000. Also very high owned as well, so it didn't really matter. But $6,100. I know the matchup versus Chicago isn't great, but he's still the wide receiver 1 on this offense, and Deshaun Watson's got to get the ball somewhere. Now, I know they had a random wide receiver and Hanson pop up for them, so I guess there's some other guys that are definitely going to have some roles in this offense. But for the most part, it's Cooks, it's Cutie. I know the matchup versus the Bears isn't great. They're allowing the 4th fewest points into the wide receiver position, and their 8th DVA versus the pass. But just from a volume perspective, Cooks should definitely be in play here. Corey Davis, $5,700. I said in my video last week that Corey Davis, I think he's in a great spot. There's no Denzel Ward. There's also the highest over under the slate, and he wasn't really getting that much love. I think he came in around 5% ownership last week, and he went absolutely off at around 40 DraftKings points. Obviously, I was not expecting him to get 40 DraftKings points, but I thought he'd be a solid play for a guy that's averaging around 7 targets per game. He went absolutely nuclear. Can't really expect that again. It was a fantastic matchup versus the Jaguars. They once again have one of the highest total games this week per Vegas, and they also have one of the highest implied team totals this week at 30 points. Now, they are 7-point favorites compared to 5.5, but I mean, both these defenses aren't that great, and if this game turns into a shootout, I could see Corey Davis once again having a pretty strong game. Now, the ownership should definitely be up this week, despite his price going up, just because if people look at the game log, Corey Davis, scored nearly 40 DraftKings points. People are just going to plug him in based off of that due to his price tag being below $6,000. But he's got a 23% target share in the season, a 32% market share of the team's air yards. There's definitely a lot of upside here and a pretty good matchup. The Jacksonville Jaguars are 31st DVA versus the pass and allowing the 5th most points per game to the wide receiver position. He's also much cheaper than A.J. Brown, so definitely have a lot of interest in Corey Davis. Antonio Brown at $5,500. Didn't really have a good game last time out, but I like him here versus the Minnesota Vikings. This is definitely one of the worst secondaries in football, the Minnesota Vikings. And they have a 29-point implied team total here. It's a 51.5-point over-under. I could definitely see this game being a shootout. Now, on the season, only a 17% target share, 20% market share of the team's air yards. But from a PPR perspective, I know the game before last one out versus the Chiefs, he was heavily targeted in that game, where he had 13 targets, and I think the last week he only had 3 or 4 targets. But assuming that's somewhere in the middle, I think at $5,500 he's definitely a fine option here. A really big wide receiver versus quarterback matchup this week. And the Vikings, they're allowing the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position, over 1.5 receiving touchdowns as well. So I think Brown's a fine play at $5,500. Tim Patrick at $4,200. I don't really like rostering Denver Broncos, but he did have 2 touchdowns the last time they played. In the matchup versus Carolina, they've actually been a bit stingy versus wide receivers, but overall they're still 24th DVA versus the pass, and Tim Patrick is a talented wide receiver. On the season, close to a 20% target share, over 5 targets per game, and an 8 out of 14. So at $4,200, he doesn't have to do much to pay off value, and I think he's a fine value wide receiver. As is Brashad Perriman at $3,900. Only caught 1 ball last week, but this is a fantastic matchup versus Seattle. It's just I never really love rostering Jets, but they've struggled versus wide receivers all season long. The only bad thing about rostering Jets is they always have low implied team total, so there's really not that much touchdown upside, only a 16.75 implied team total. But them being 13.5-point dogs on the road, this should be a pass-heavy game script. And Perriman always has the upside to hit the big plays, got an 8 out of 15.5 this year with a 30% market share of the team's air yards. Now, I like him better when Joe Flacco is his quarterback because he's not afraid to just chuck the ball deep. But it's still a good matchup versus Seattle. They're 29th DVA versus the pass, and they're allowing the most points per game to the wide receiver position with 50.7 DraftKings points per game. That number has definitely gone down a lot from early on in the season. I remember at one point they were allowing 80 DraftKings points per game, then 70 DraftKings points per game. It keeps going down, but it's still the most points they've allowed. It's still the team that's allowed the most points to the wide receiver position. So Perriman at $3,100, I think he's viable, as is Jamison Crowder and Denzel Mims. I just didn't feel like listing 3 Jets wide receivers because that's absolutely gross. And I think with that being said, we can move on to the tight end position, which is really never an exciting position to talk about. But up top, it's the usual Travis Kelce at $7,400. He's finally on a main slate. I feel like it's been a while. Well, that's not true. He was just on the main slate against Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Okay, but anyway, matchup versus Miami. I don't care about matchups when it comes to Travis Kelce. It's just they're going to be able to move the ball. I don't care what the matchup is. He's the best tight end in football. Tyreek Hill is one of the best wide receivers in football. They're pretty much the best downfield threat. And Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in football. So matchups don't really matter. He's got a massive tight end versus safety matchup this week per PFF. The Dolphins are allowing these 6 fewest points per game to the position, but again, I don't really care. Kelce's averaging close to 100 receiving yards per game, close to double-digit targets per game, over half a receiving touchdown, and a 24% target share. That's elite numbers for a tight end, so you certainly play if you have the money. It's just might be tough spending $7,400 for a tight end this week, although roster construction, not sure exactly what it's going to look like yet, so if this is a spend-up tight end week, obviously Kelce is the top option. TJ Hockenson at $5,000. Doesn't sound like Kenny Golladay is going to give it a go this week, and if that's the case, obviously it's a bump for TJ Hockenson. It's a 55-point over-under game, so I would expect a lot of points to be scored in this one. They're also 7.5-point dogs at home, so if this turns into a pass-heavy game script for the Detroit Lions, I think Hockenson should be a pretty safe play here. Kind of a lock for double-digit points. It's just going to be a matter if he gets into the end zone, if he really is going to pay off that $5,000 price tag. But over 6 targets per game this season, close to a 20% target share. I know those numbers look pretty pedestrian when you compare them to Travis Kelce, but it's kind of not fair to compare any other tight end, maybe besides Darren Waller, to Travis Kelce this year. So he's definitely a fine option given his price point. Hunter Henry, $4,400 is just a good matchup versus Atlanta. Now, a few weeks ago, they were actually dead last versus tight ends. That number has improved a little bit. They're now allowing the 27th most points per game to the position compared to 32nd, but still a good spot for Hunter Henry, and they're allowing close to a touchdown per game. He's never an exciting play, but the volume's there for him most weeks, so I think he's decently safe given his $4,400 price tag. Robert Tonyan, he's caught touchdowns in 3 games in a row, and $4,200. I know the price came up a little bit. I still think he's a fine option. They have the highest implied team total on the slate. And I would not be surprised if he finds the end zone once again. He's averaging close to 0.7 touchdowns per game. So definitely a threat in the red zone. Cole Kmet, $2,900. Actually had a pretty decent game last week, where he had 7 targets, 5 catches, got into the end zone, and had close to 40 receiving yards. He outsnapped Jimmy Graham, so at $2,100, it's a good matchup versus Houston. He is certainly in play for me. And at the same price tag, we have the very disappointing Jordan Akins at $2,900. You would think he would get a nice bump in targets and everything, with Randall Cobb being out, Will Fuller being out. Really wasn't the case too much, although he's going to be on the field. I think he's fine, but I mean, I feel like Kmet could easily outscore him even at the same price tag, although I always like having Deshaun Watson throw me the football over Mitch Trubisky, but if the volume's not going to be there for Jordan Akins, he's definitely going to be hard to trust, and there'll probably be touchdown or bust for your lineups. Then moving on to the defenses. Don't really like talking about defenses, but for the most part, I just try to find favorites or teams that may be just a little bit too cheap with upside. I'm not a big fan of any of the expensive defenses this week, and the most expensive defense is the Saints at $3,300. I think they're viable. They're tough versus the run and versus the pass this year. They're also facing a rookie quarterback. It's just, I don't know. I feel like I can get similar production from these defenses that are much cheaper, like the Seattle Seahawks at $3,000. They're facing the worst team in football, and they're at home. They're 13.5-point favorites, and they're only $3,000, so you could probably sign me up for them. I assume they'll probably end up being the chalk defense, because usually the defense that plays the Jets is around $4,000, and that's just not the case this week. The Washington football team, we saw them take care of business versus Pittsburgh. They got a solid defensive front. They're good versus the pass and versus the run. I mean, Nick Mullins doesn't exactly scare me, so I know they have some good pieces in Raheem Mostert, Brandon Ayuk, and Deebo Samuel, and some other guys, but overall not too concerned there. So at $2,800, I think they're fine. Only a 23.25 implied team total against them anyway. Then we have the 49ers on the flip side of the ball. Not that scared of the Washington football team offense, especially with Antonio Gibson out. Although I know they did take care of business versus Pittsburgh, but still not overly concerned about that offense. Then the Cowboys, their defense sucks, but they're playing Cincinnati. And the Bengals, their defense isn't that great, but they're also playing the Cowboys. So nothing really too exciting here. They're just cheap enough, and I think they're fine given their matchups. And with that being said, guys, that's going to be it for this video. So I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for getting me over 7,000 subscribers. Can't thank you guys enough. I really do appreciate it. If you want to follow me over on social media, you can do that in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you want to support the channel over on Patreon, always much appreciated. Link is down below for that. If you want access to the entire sheet, got the cheat sheet on there, the notes, projections, you can hop to the Discord chat, and all that fun stuff. It's $10 a month, and think that's enough for the plugging, so that's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next video, which will be the showdown video for the Patriots and the Rams.